Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's great to have you all here. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Leala Rosen, who happened to have been an intern with Eco-Agriculture Partners for a while she was doing her Master's of Professional Studies in International Agriculture and Rural Development at Cornell. Just graduated in 2020. And Leala presently is a program officer with the Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS, and she works primarily with an external partnership called Conservation Leadership Program. And that program builds leadership and program management capacity of early career conservationists through trainings and grants on the conservation of at-risk species. And before she came to Cornell to do her MPS, she was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal. And when she came back to study, she did her master's on a question that piqued her interest as a Peace Corps volunteer, having to do with, in the context of community forest management, how do we make community forest user groups more socially inclusive? And she's very interested in the whole question of gender equity in sustainable food systems and in natural resource management. And so we're very lucky to have Leala to come back and talk to us on gender equity and social inclusion among community forest groups in the mid-hills of Nepal. Who benefits? Thank you, Leala, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Louise, for the great introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So,
Good.
let's see. As Louise mentioned, I currently work at the Wildlife Conservation Society, and I graduated with a Master's in Professional Studies in Global Development last August from Cornell. So happy to discuss that at any point. And today's presentation is going to focus on my master's capstone research, which is gender equity and social inclusion among community forest user groups in Nepal. Who benefits? And I have slow bandwidth here where I am, so I'm going to turn off my video for the call itself. Let's see. 1 second. But it'll be back for Q&A. So thank you so much for having me. I just wanted to give a little bit of background. So kind of the interest behind this research, as Louise mentioned, this research was conducted as part of my Master's of Professional Studies in Global Development at Cornell CALS. And I served as a food security volunteer with the Peace Corps Nepal program in Lumjung in Western Nepal in 2014 and 15. And so I'm very familiar with this region. I have a lot of friends and community members and colleagues from the place that's the research setting for this research. And I have a very deep interest in this topic of community forestry, natural resource management, and gender equity and social inclusion. I conducted this research in the winter of 2019 and 2020 over 4 weeks during Cornell's winter break. And during that time, I actually stayed with my Peace Corps host family and worked collaboratively with my research assistant, Ramala, who is pictured here, who I've known for 6 years, and she's one of my very good friends. And so a lot of this research, I really want to make sure to credit her and my colleagues in Lumjung for being very instrumental in the research and just also developing really deep friendships over the past several years. And when I met Ramala 6 years ago, she was a field staff member for a USAID nutrition program, and she's now the in charge at the Village Health Post. And also I wanted to share just really briefly that after Peace Corps and before I went to Cornell, I've also worked primarily with different nonprofit organizations in my hometown of Dallas, Texas, working primarily with vulnerable populations on issues of food security, agriculture, leadership, and capacity building. So that has also inspired this research topic and interest as well. And at Cornell, my research and coursework focused on the nexus of environmental conservation, gender equity, and capacity building, which led me to my current role at WCS. And so, as Louise mentioned, I work on the Conservation Leadership Program, working to build leadership capacity of early career conservationists through training, small grants to work on the conservation of at-risk species, and sharing other professional development opportunities. And also, I think this is important to share that all of the pictures in this PowerPoint are photos that I've taken unless otherwise mentioned. Most Nepalese are smallholder farmers, and 80% of the population is rural, with socioeconomic drivers such as migration and the flow of remittances. Female-headed households are the norm for rural agrarian regions. As female-headed households have more responsibilities for education, household nutrition, and subsistence agriculture, this also contributes to the double bind that these women face, which means increased decision-making and responsibility, but a lack of power within Nepali society. While many gender mainstreaming development projects seek to empower women, and many community groups consist primarily of women, they're often still excluded from access to cash crop production, markets, formal agricultural training, and land ownership. And another piece of this is that due to increased rates of outmigration, more and more private land is becoming fallow, but landless workers still don't have equitable access to agricultural land. According to the 2011 Nepal census, 89% of rural women in Nepal do not own land. Gender, caste, and ethnicity-based forms of social exclusion further exacerbate this issue. Community forest management is a component of the community-based natural resource management practices that were formally introduced worldwide in the 1970s to promote forest management in partnership with local communities using the forest. These communities are often indigenous rural populations. The main components of community forest management include the involvement of local people in forest governance, sustainable forest management for wood or non-timber forest products for either ecological or social value, and the recognized use of forest products for subsistence and income generating activities among local communities. Community forest management was created to increase reforestation efforts as well as rates of carbon sequestration around the world, as well as empower the poor through income generating sustainable forestry activities at the local level. Nepal in particular is highlighted as a successful model of this decentralized community-based natural resource management, so very much at the local village level, through the local governance of public forests. And community forests in Nepal account for over 1 million hectares of land spread out across all the ecozones in all but one district of Nepal. While forest governance strategies differ, the governance model within Nepal is seen as participatory in nature. Basically, the central government owns forested land and develops contracts with local forest user groups in rural villages. These user groups engage in community forest monitoring, reforestation efforts, and knowledge sharing about environmental issues, as well as climate change adaptation efforts. Local forest user groups are formed at the village level. So this form of really localized management of forests has significantly improved forest conditions and rural livelihoods. Nepal's community forest model is recognized around the world as a progressive, innovative form of community-based natural resource management, both for its biophysical benefits as well as the inclusion of rural remote villagers throughout the country. According to a World Wildlife Nepal report in 2018, in the past 25 years of their work on community forest governance and environmental conservation in Nepal, 23,000 hectares of forest land were restored, and 5,000 community forest user groups attended trainings on forest management, biodiversity conservation, and good governance to facilitate better management of community forests. The primary social and economic benefits of this forest management system are income generating activities, enhanced rural livelihoods, increased decision-making power among local communities, and traditionally socially excluded populations. Improve social capital, such as the inclusion of marginalized populations, women, low caste groups, and low income populations in Nepal, is another proposed benefit of community forest management. Community forest user groups in Nepal have increased the participation of rural women and low caste populations, likely improving their social capital at the community level. So switching gears a little bit to talk more explicitly about gender equity and social inclusion in context. Community forest user groups consist of a representative proportion of men and women, and spaces are reserved for Dalits and disadvantaged groups. However, socially inclusive participation and decision-making power in terms of group member selection, leadership, and participation is still unclear. In the 1990s, gender equality and women's empowerment were the prevailing development strategies set forth to enhance women's participation and decision-making power in agriculture, education, forestry, governance, and other sectors. Over the past 30 years, it's become widely recognized that women's empowerment schemes are prone to elite capture, or when more well-off populations are more likely to take advantage of different groups or development programs due to eligibility requirements. And so this leads to the exclusion of marginalized populations from participating. The government of Nepal committed to following a gender equity and social inclusion framework in 2014, and 7 ministries are implementing gender equity and social inclusion policies and guidelines, which are being monitored by specially trained staff within each ministry. And it's also really important to note that Nepal is a very diverse country with over 100 ethnic groups represented. Caste, class, and gender must be considered in development planning and implementation in order to reduce social disparities and the resulting likelihood of elite capture. Otherwise, these development initiatives will be prone to whitewashing their programs using gender as a shield of inclusiveness. Of course, it's easier to count the number of women in development programs, such as the Community Forestry Program, than to ensure that all class, caste, and genders are participating equitably, including the most marginalized poor who have traditionally been barred from participation. Structural barriers such as land tenure status further limit equitable participation of the ultra poor from community forest user group memberships. Many of these community forest user groups are led by elite groups in rural villages, while women participate and are involved in decision making. Systemic issues of socioeconomic stratification, as I mentioned, contribute to the exclusion of poor, more marginalized populations from participating in the system altogether. And just to talk a little bit about the research setting for this master's capstone research, this research took place in Lamjung, which is a medium-sized district in the mid-hills of Western Nepal within the mountainous agroecological zone. It has a population of around 167,000 people. And this is the area where I was a Peace Corps volunteer. This is actually, the research took place in the village where I was living and a nearby village. Approximately 49% of Lamjung is covered by forest land. And within that forested area, about 28% of the land is part of the Annapurna Conservation Area. 30% is managed by, is community forest managed, so by these user groups. And the rest of the forest land is managed by the Lamjung District Forest Department. As of 2014 report, Lamjung has 317 community forest user groups made up of 25,284 households. And just to note that this represents 84% of households within the district. And also, much like other mid-hills regions throughout Nepal, Lamjung is abundant in natural resources, which has led to recent natural resource extraction projects such as hydropower dams on the Marsingdi River, road infrastructure development, including the China-India Transnational Highway nearby, has also led to a decrease in public forested land throughout Nepal in the past few years. Lamjung is comparable to other districts of similar size in terms of household size, home and land ownership, and migration patterns. It is very mixed caste and also has the largest Gurung population, which is an ethnic minority group by district in Nepal. And within Lamjung, 2 villages within the local government region of Chiti were selected for the research setting. The villages are Siaut and Chiti Tilahar. These villages are representative of an ideal typical case for examining the research questions, which I'll share, as it's a mid-sized area of about 5,166 residents, consisting of many small villages and a main town bazaar. So in terms of problem statement, the very localized or decentralized governance model of Nepal's community forestry initiatives has been replicated in several other developing countries, and the overall environmental benefits are numerous. However, the role of gender equity and social inclusion among these groups is less clear. Although substantial efforts in terms of gender mainstreaming and social inclusion initiatives have been undertaken, and women can actively participate in community forest user groups as well as hold leadership positions, there are still barriers to group entry that limit social inclusion. Social difference must be considered, otherwise elite capture remains more likely, furthering systemic inequality and excluding traditionally marginalized groups. This research uses community forest user groups, as well as the Haryo-Ban forestry program, as a case study for gender equity and social inclusion programs within the development and natural resource management sectors. And this research analyzed the socioeconomic and environmental benefits of participation in community forest user groups in Nepal, with a critical lens on gender equity and social inclusion, in order to answer the following questions. The first, to what extent and in what ways do these groups influence social inclusion, especially among women? And to what extent is the recognition of patterns of change in gender equity and social inclusion made explicit within community forestry programming? And just to touch briefly on the conceptual framework, which I would also like to give credit to Dr. Sarah Drew for working on this with me. Standard approaches from development actors working in the community forestry space has traditionally emphasized programs that target women and the economically marginalized. However, these programs have tended to conflate the characteristics of gender equity and social inclusion as one term, implying that these are synergistic and not potentially competing social categories. So this is a big piece of this research as well. And for data and methodology, to better explore the interplay between gender equity and social inclusion, two main approaches were used. Content analysis of reports on a key Nepali community forestry user group program, the Haryo-Ban program, as well as primary research in the form of focus groups with community participants in both of the villages that I mentioned. And for the sampling plan, we conducted 2 focus groups with 7 to 10 women in each, and households were the unit of analysis. And my research assistant coordinated and facilitated all of these. I was there to observe and record them. And shifting gears in terms of findings, I wanted to share some of the direct benefits as well as the indirect benefits that we found throughout these focus group discussions. The primary direct benefit mentioned by both focus groups was improved household nutrition from the availability of wild edible foods from the forest. Depending on the season, a variety of wild edible plants can be foraged in community forests. And these include mangoes, fiddlehead ferns, gooseberries, lamb's quarter, stinging nettle, taro, among others. This research also made me realize that I really love foraging, but happy to talk about that offline. And also, income generating activities were one of the most frequently discussed direct benefits. In addition to wild foods foraged and sold by community forest user group members, other income generating activities were mentioned, including non-timber forestry products, medicinal herbs, and the contribution of fodder to household livestock health. Women shared that they will sustainably harvest and sell extra firewood, medicinal herbs, and non-timber forestry products for additional household income. Agroforestry products were also mentioned, both in relation to income generating activities as well as focus group respondents learning about sustainable landscape management. Several women mentioned that they took agroforestry techniques that they'd learned through attending monthly community forest meetings and incorporated them into their private agricultural land. For example, one of the main agroforestry practices discussed was intercropping Nepalese alder trees with shade-grown cardamom for increased cardamom production. Fodder, another important direct benefit, was also mentioned several times. Participants stated that the availability of fodder, as well as the income generating from selling milk, contributed to their decision-making around the purchase of additional small ruminants. Focus group participants also discussed a variety of indirect benefits gained from participating in these groups. These included access to improved soil health and water retention, climate change adaptation knowledge gained, and the role of forests in sustainable landscape management. In terms of social benefits, women spoke about spending time outside of the home with friends, being able to learn more about community forest conservation during monthly meetings, being seen as knowledgeable on environmental conservation throughout the community, and the social learning that's gained through being part of these groups. And in terms of more specifically gender equity, social inclusion, and exclusion, previously, women were not allowed to join community forest user groups. Focus group respondents discussed women forming their own informal groups 7 to 8 years ago because they were denied entry to the local community forest user groups. Women's participation and leadership among these group members interviewed has significantly increased in the past 5 to 6 years. And this was most noticeable in the focus group with villagers from Seattle, which is pictured here. Over time, the rules have since changed, and now leadership within these groups for president and vice president must be composed of one man and one woman. While gender mainstreaming efforts have increased women's participation, most women I spoke to in the Seattle Village group were high caste Brahmin women, with the exception of one lower caste Dalit woman. So that's just something to share from the focus group. And also something that I learned from these focus group conversations is that in order to participate in community forest user groups, people must own their own land, either in their own name or their husband or family's name. While policies that seek to include women, Dalits, and other marginalized groups within community forest user group participation exist, the exclusion of low-income landless tenants continues to exacerbate elite capture within these groups. When focus group respondents were asked about landless tenants' perceptions of community forest user groups, several women shared that they did not think landless tenants would be interested in joining these groups. This statement can likely be attributed to class-based perceptions of interest in formalized utilization of community forests in the area. And just briefly, I wanted to talk about the findings for the content analysis. In each report narrative, I coded for key terms, including women, gender, inclusion, class, poverty, caste, etc., to understand the extent to which these factors were considered. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I think you cut out for a while.
We lost you
Hello, can you hear me? I think my
Yes.
internet cut out.
Yeah, we lost you for about a minute or minute and a half, but we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Okay.
We are not seeing your slides.
She appears to be on mute.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Sorry about that.
We can now.
Shoot. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay, great. I will continue, and if you can't hear me, please let me know.
Okay, we did lose your slide.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
We can hear you,
see your
but we're
slide.
not seeing your presentation.
Okay. Is this okay? Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear us, Leela?
I think she cut out again.
Let me make a suggestion here while we're waiting to see if Leela can get the technology fixed. Perhaps we could take a couple questions and then I can put those in the chat box for Leila, or perhaps Louise, who's worked fairly extensively with Leila, can answer some of those or address some of those questions. So if someone has a question, just go ahead and either unmute yourself or raise the hand and using the box at the bottom. We'll try to make this time productive as we can.
It may be that Dr. March should be able to answer them better than I can also.
I doubt that, but I have lots and lots of questions that that maybe to this whole group here that I think are really important. I mean, I was most struck by the exclusion of landless village members from community forestry groups. The area that I worked in, they are probably the dominant members. The community forestry, now the area I worked in is east of the area that Leela is talking about, and it's primarily ethnically Tamang, not ethnically Gurung, but there. And in fact, this is one reason I put this, I get my head out, get me out of the way of this picture here. This background that I put up, okay, well, sort of. If I put, no, I can't, you can't see. Well, maybe you can't see, but I can see. There was substantial waste, supposedly wasteland, that is agricultural land that was not very successful agricultural, very, very little irrigable land there. And the community forestry groups, one of the remarkable things that they did in this area was that landless people were given, they weren't given ownership, they weren't given title to, but they were, as a collectivity, supported for the reforestation of some of these deforested, marginalized, and somewhat vulnerable lands. Does anybody know if that's is that a did I work in an aberrant area or in the other areas where you're familiar with? Was it more common practice to exclude landless households from community forestry user groups? Anybody?
Catherine,
Oh,
sorry
there
about my internet cutting back out. I think it is a really good question. And of course, I can only speak from this research, but
Right.
it is a common problem, not just within this community forestry program, but within a lot of development programs, just the eligibility requirements that,
Yeah.
development programs have really good intentions and want to do a lot of good. But if you need to own land in your husband's name, for example, and you can't join a program, then.
Right. No, I was really struck by that because, when you talk about
Communities will
elite,
just not be able to join.
right. No, when you talk about elite capture, which is something that any program that's concerned about inclusion and equity has to attend to, many forms of elite capture are much, they're not institutionalized by these kinds of eligibility requirements. So I was really, that struck me deeply.
Right, definitely. Yeah. Is it possible to just spend 2 or 3 minutes on the conclusion and then go back to Q&A?
That would be fine. Sure. Absolutely.
Sure. Thanks so much for your patience. I'm actually now hotspotting from a cell phone, so thank you. And so if you can't hear me, just please say so or put it in the chat box. But I just wanted to briefly talk about kind of bringing everything together. So while the participation of women, Dalits, and other marginalized groups has increased among community forest user groups within the past decade, these trends, as I mentioned, are limited to middle and upper class groups that are landowners, and landless tenants, such as the ultra poor, lack equitable benefit sharing. And this exclusionary practice perpetuates development initiative, as Nepal, as I mentioned. And while this program has been replicated in other countries, in terms of gender equity and social inclusion, of course, there's still some work to be done in order for these groups to be socially inclusive, incorporating class and social difference to limit elite capture and promote more inclusive programming. And gender mainstreaming has allowed women to participate and lead community forest user groups, enabling environments for gender inclusive policies and practices. Finally, social difference, including age, caste, class, and ethnicity, is just harder to measure than gender. And the conflation of gender equity and social inclusion within international development programming as one term makes it complicated to analyze the measurable impact. The government of Nepal, in partnership with NGO and private sector implementing organizations, should implement policies that promote gender equity and social inclusion as two different components of inclusive development. At the local level, caste, class, and gender, both in community forest user groups and other locally governed groups. Building upon the environmental conservation benefits of Nepal's community forestry program, which are numerous, incorporating gender equity and social inclusion as two distinct markers of social difference could be a powerful example used to improve inclusion, and others to take a moment to acknowledge who have helped me with this research. Dr. Sarah Drew, my advisor at Cornell and Graham, Dr. Terry Tucker, Dr. Lori Leonard, Dr. Louise Bach, and Engaged Cornell for providing funding to do this field work. The South Asia program and the Nepali person Nepali for this. And most importantly, my research assistant. So thank you very much, and thanks again for your patience with my internet. I really look forward to hearing any.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I'd love to hear any questions, and yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Leila, and thanks for soldiering on despite the inequity that we know about in broadband access in rural America. So
Right.
Appreciate you sharing that with us. And now Louise is going to facilitate the additional Q&A.
Right. So I see that Manoj has a question. Your hand is up. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Leela, for a very interesting topic, a very nice presentation, and your research work is really wonderful. And I have very curiosity on the one thing that usually in a forest user group, there is some restriction to the user member to collect the firewood and leaves for their livelihoods, and how this restriction affected to the poor and marginalized community, people especially who are the lead and marginalized, who daily needs these firewoods and leaves for their livelihoods. How have you seen there?
Thank you for your question, Manoj. I think it's a really big question because as part of being in these groups, members are supposed to share environmental and conservation knowledge that they've learned from being in the groups with other members of the community. And part of that is sustainable non-timber forestry and fodder harvesting. However, the divide comes when people who don't own land and really need to go into the forest to get firewood or various things, they might not have the same knowledge of sustainable forest management and what should be harvested and how and that kind of thing. So there is definitely a divide there as well.
Yeah. Have you found that really they are suffered from these rules in forest user group?
Did you hear his follow-up question, Leela?
No, I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
Yeah. Do you think that did you find that they are really affected by these some rules made by the community forest user group for the restriction?
That's a good question. I think it's probably a case-by-case basis because, they're rules, but it just depends on how they're enforced. And since it is community governed, that's just going to be like at the village level who's talking to people about that. And sure, the rules are in place, but that doesn't necessarily mean people's behaviors have changed.
Okay.
I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Daniel.
Yes, thank you, Leela, for introducing us to that really engaging topic, especially speaking as another South Asia Program FLAS Fellow for this current academic year. One of the things that I always like for people who are focused on ecological groups in South Asia is to see if there might be any influence in terms of different activist behaviors because of foreign direct investment, and especially because in Nepal, I really look at how China infrastructural projects could in some ways be a factor in these groups' operations. Of course, if you haven't encountered that in your own research, that's okay, but I figured I'd ask anyway, since it's related to my own.
I am going to say that that's beyond the scope of this research. However, that sounds really interesting, so I might connect with you after this. Yeah,
Okay,
but that's a
great.
really good question.
Catherine, the floor is yours.
I purposely just raised my hand so that somebody else would have a chance here. You talked, Leila, about the income generation, and of course that was one of the big interests in establishing these community forestry things, in addition to the the protection of land, protection of environment, and more recently, carbon sequestration. And the only thing you mentioned was cardamom. And I wondered if you could talk about other ways in which this may go back a little bit to Manoj's question about other kinds of forest products and other users' access to them. And in particular, I'm curious because, again, in the area that I worked, which was very heavily hit by the earthquake, the sale of timber resources to community members who need timber to rebuild with was a very, very interesting case in point as to how robust these user groups had become in terms of adjudicating equitable access to forest resources. So they came up with very complicated ways of thinking about how much timber different people could have access to and what rates different households would pay for the timber and whether or not they were going to sell any of the timber to non-community members at higher rates and so on and so forth. So it's a general question about income generation, but also specifically in relation to post-earthquake, if the earthquake affected them at all.
Yes, so that is an excellent question. I think just for this presentation, I didn't focus as much on specific income generating activities since it was more about gender equity and social inclusion, but I'm sure this is the case in the village where you have done much of your research as well, but there's so many different products from the forest that have been used for income generating activities. So at least in these villages where I conducted this research, it's the same kind of thing that people who are in the forest user groups determine which products will be able to be sold to people within their communities, within the larger community. They will set prices for people, within the communities versus slightly outside of it. So they try to do kind of sliding scale of prices based on that. I didn't ask specifically in terms of earthquake specific, like home building and that kind of thing. I was more interested at the time in food security and nutrition, more so those kinds of products. So things like honey, people will collect wild bees from the forest and start their own hives. And the local agriculture center does promotions where you can attend beekeeping workshops and then get like a half off your beekeeping starter kit. And a lot of people just go and start collecting hives from the forest and bringing them there. There's also just a lot of different medicinal herbs that people will collect and then sell just at the local village level. Cardamom was one of the most highly talked about, and I think it's a pretty big cash crop in Nepal. Nepal is actually, I read this yesterday, they're formalizing the 5 species of cardamom for commercial production. So I think those are going to be patented. And there's all kinds of other things too, just things like taro or fiddlehead ferns from the forest and lots of different food products. But I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure specifically in terms of timber and things like that for earthquake building, but it's definitely a good question.
So it looks like we don't have any other questions. We have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to ask a question. But anyone else who has one, please just raise your hand. I'm curious as to what interventions to help improve social equity or gender equity and social inclusion, or either one of those or both, you were aware of. I know you were part of, I don't know, it looked like from your credits that this was at least done in the proximity of, if not directly part of, a USAID project that went on for a long time. And I'm just curious about what kinds of measures might have been taken to try to improve the situation there.
Yes, I think it's kind of twofold. So there needs to be more focus kind of both at the programmatic planning level of development programs as well as culturally. And just speaking about the community forest user groups within Nepal,
Mhm.
I am not super familiar with more recent programs, like new programs that have changed this, but I will say that within Haryoban, even in the past 2 years or so, they have been focusing more on social inclusion practices. So
Mhm.
moving beyond women's participation and looking more so at, okay, well, how can we get more marginalized populations involved, and how can that also contribute to income generating activities and making sure that people who are interested in selling non-timber forestry products or sustainably managed timber, things like that, how can they access these programs? So it's definitely something that's being looked into. And, you know, these things do take time, but I think just really at the planning level, I don't know, it's tricky because in so many development programs, gender equity and social inclusion is always seen as one thing. And
Yes.
so it's just so much easier to count the number of women or to say, we have a quota and we have one Dalit person in our group, or we have one disabled person in our group. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have more decision-making power. So I would say it's a continuing process.
Well, good. I hope so. Well, if I guess we're out of time and we're out of questions too, at least at this point. So it's probably a good note to end on. Leila, thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation. And thanks, as Terry says, thanks for persisting and seeing it through.
Yes, and thank you so much for your patience with my internet connectivity. But it was wonderful to be here virtually with all of you. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen. And I also wanted to share, if anyone has any follow-up questions or would like to reach out to me, you can email me. I'll type it in the chat.
Looks
Yeah,
like
but
Daniel has one more thing he would like to say. Go ahead, Daniel, if you do.
Oh, sorry, that was just an applause
Oh, okay.
reaction.
Sorry, I misread it. Yes,
No problem.
share applause.
yeah, but thank you so much. And yes, feel free to email me at lrosen@wcs.org. I'm always happy to reach out. So yeah,
Great.
thanks so much for having me.
Okay, thanks again.
Thanks,
Good
Leila.
Sure.
luck in future work. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.